Hello, and welcome back. Today we discuss the French Revolution, which started in 1789. In an age in which absolutist monarchical rule dominated European politics, we see ordinary people in France that rose to voice their discontent with the established order and impose an alternative to the rule of the privileged. The French Revolution erupted on July 14, 1789, with the Parisian assault of the Bastille, a royal fortress and prison. Over the next few years, events unfolded with astonishing rapidity. Founded on the principles of liberty, equality, and fraternity, undoubtedly the most famous slogan of the Revolution, and structured by a new republican form of government, the French Revolution transformed France and large parts of Europe. So let's begin. In the 18th century, France was one of the most powerful kingdoms in the world, second only to England perhaps. It was also ruled by an absolutist king, Louis XVI. Although well-intentioned as rulers, the king and his wife, Marie Antoinette, you see her here on the right, lived a life of excess and luxury. They resided in an expansive palace in Versailles, a small town outside of Paris, and spent much of the crown's money on rich indulgences. For example, when their daughter married, King Louis XVI declared 100 days of celebrations. Every night saw great feasts and dances. Royalty from all over Europe were invited to watch the king and his family eat. That's right, the king would sit and eat, and the invitees would stand in a circle around the table watching. These celebrations were reflective of the detachment from the realities of Louis's kingdom. As with the American Revolution, radical change came to France as a result of a series of crises. The ideas of the Enlightenment incited growing criticism of the king and the absolutist government. The American Revolution also served as a model to follow. However, it was not until the crown was overcome by a fiscal crisis in 1787 that the French people began to consider overthrowing the king. Long wars against the English, including the French participation in the American War of Independence, depleted the French coffers. By 1787, banks around Europe refused to issue the crown any further credits, plummeting the government into bankruptcy. In an attempt to raise taxes, the king called a meeting of the Estates General, which included representatives from three social groups or estates: the royalty, the church, and the third would be the rest of the population, which actually turned out to be about 95% of the total. Because of the crown's absolutist power, the Estates General had not been called since 1614. When the three estates met in May of 1789, the king was confident that it would pass the new taxes since each estate had only one vote. In other words, a total of 3 votes, one for each estate. As such, the first 2 estates, the royalty and the church, would always outnumber the third estate. However, the third estate refused to accept these terms and insisted that the voting should be representative of the actual membership of each estate, which would have given the third estate a great majority of the votes. The king refused, and the third estate representatives left the proceedings to form an independent governing body, which they called the National Assembly, in a tennis court that was close by. Inspired by the Enlightenment ideas, the Assembly signed what it called the Tennis Court Oath, agreeing to not give in until a new constitution was signed reflecting their new authority. But even then, the revolt of the third estate would not have led to a revolution if it were not for the bread riots that broke out in Paris in the following months. Quite by coincidence, there had been an extreme drought the previous year, leaving France without enough wheat to provide enough bread to its cities. As the bread supply dried up, Parisians grew in desperation. The bread shortages were especially impacting considering that bread made up 50% of a Parisian's diet. Meat and vegetables made up 25%, and wine the remaining 25%. As bread ran out, Parisians turned to the next cheapest source of calories, wine. Angry and drunk, Parisians started assaulting government buildings. Rumors had arisen asserting the shortage was a government conspiracy against the Third Estate. The confrontations climaxed on July 14, 1789, when some 800 Parisians stormed the Bastille. You see an image of it here, a fortress and jail in the center of the city. The small group of soldiers defending the fortress soon surrendered, opening the gates only to be mauled by the angry crowds. The captain of the Bastille was run through with swords and his head was cut off and paraded through the city on a stake. The French Revolution had begun. Revolutionaries marched out to Versailles to arrest the king and his family. They were brought back to Paris and put in jail. The monarchy had lost its power, and the new revolutionary government, based on the National Assembly, was in control. The guiding principles of the revolutionary government were outlined in the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen, which you actually see a copy of here in the image, which outlined the three main guiding principles of the new government: liberty, equality, and fraternity. The French Constitution of 1791, signed a couple of years later, would reflect these guiding principles. The Constitution asserted that all men were created equal, at least in opportunity. It defended liberty for all and insisted that civil positions would be determined by ability and talent, not privilege. Lastly, it asserted the sovereignty of the people above that of crowns or nobility. One of the most radical consequences of the new constitution was the abolition of slavery in France in 1794. However, much as with the American Revolution, women were not included in the radical reforms. Women had actively participated in the popular uprisings early on in the Revolution. They had made up the majority of those that went out to Versailles to arrest the king. Many of them had given their lives to the revolutionary cause. But even though women symbolized the revolution in many ways, they were largely left out. The success of the revolution in France surprised many in Europe, especially the monarchs of other kingdoms. These kings declared war on France in an attempt to defeat the revolution before it spread to their lands. In 1792, the near defeat of the French army at the hands of the Prussian army led to the establishment of a more centralized and, it was hoped, more effective government in France, led by the Jacobin Party and its leader Robespierre. Robespierre's determination to unite France by imposing the general will that you remember Rousseau talked about by force initiated a period of persecution and death referred to as the Reign of Terror. In just over a year, the Reign of Terror claimed over 17,000 lives, all of them executed with the guillotine, a new machine that you see here, developed precisely for this purpose. Interestingly enough, the guillotine was praised by many in the revolutionary government as a modern and more humane method of execution. A good example of how technology improved the lives, or even the deaths in this case, of humans. Here you have a cartoon of the time showing Robespierre boiling his enemies. Although the Reign of Terror was sold by the Jacobins as a purification of French society, eliminating the remnants of aristocratic society, almost 85% of those executed were peasants, poor people. Only 15% were actually rich nobility. The culmination of the Reign of Terror was the execution of King Louis XVI in early 1793. As you can see in the image, Louis was beheaded in public, which was actually typical for guillotine executions. After his head was severed from the body, one observer noted that the king is God no more. This symbolized the end of monarchical rule in France. After that, the king could not come back. After all, he was dead. As well as the fact that the king was ultimately human, just like everyone else. Louis' beheading sent shockwaves throughout Europe, inciting monarchies throughout the continent to join together against the French. Eventually, the Reign of Terror went too far, even for the French revolutionaries, and Robespierre and the Jacobins were removed from power. Robespierre himself would suffer the same fate of his victims, being beheaded for inciting the Great Terror. However, France still needed to fend off its enemies. The Directory and the Consulate, two different governments set up to centralize power and increase efficiency in the fight against France's enemies, soon came to be dominated by an ambitious general of the French army, Napoleon Bonaparte. He had rapidly risen through the ranks, becoming a general at the tender age of 24. Yet, his mastery of military tactics made him extremely successful in the battlefield, not only defending France, but going on the offensive and conquering most of France's enemies by 1804. His popularity among the French population facilitated this rise to absolute power. By 1804, he was the sole political head of the French government. Here you have a map of the areas Napoleon conquered. The dark green is France itself, which expanded to include the Netherlands and parts of present-day Italy. Spain, the Germanic states of Central Europe, and Poland were also controlled by France. Lastly, Norway, Denmark, Prussia, and Austria all joined France as allies. You see them in the purple here. Only Russia, Portugal, and England, in the orangish color, remained in opposition. Napoleon's rule culminated in 1804 when he crowned himself Emperor of France, returning to France a type of absolutist rule. He put an end to the revolution, but the laws he established for both France and the rest of conquered Europe, named the Code Napoleon, were inspired by the revolution and the notions of equality and liberty it had proclaimed. Napoleon would eventually be defeated by growing opposition from his enemies in 1815 at the Battle of Waterloo, and he would spend the rest of his life in exile in the island of St. Helena in the Atlantic. With the revolution and Napoleon out of the way, the victors divided up the spoils among them at the Congress of Vienna in 1815. France became a monarchy again, with Louis's son taking over as the new king, and the map of Europe was redrawn to assure a balance of power between the major military powers. This balance would ensure that no major war broke out in Europe until 1914, 99 years later. Yet, looking back at Napoleon, it must be stressed that even though he ended the revolution and imposed authoritarian rule in France, he did succeed in spreading the revolutionary spirit to the rest of Europe and other corners of the world. In fact, the French Revolution and Napoleon's exploits inspired slave revolts in Saint-Dominique, present-day Haiti, led by ex-slave Toussaint Louverture, which eventually led to the independence of Haiti from France. Lastly, the independence movements that emerged throughout the Spanish colonies in Latin America during the period that Spain was occupied by Napoleonic troops were also inspired by the revolutionary spirit of the American and French revolutions. The great liberator of America, Simón Bolívar, was very much influenced by Napoleon, as you might notice from this image. And so, in just 45 years from the start of the American Revolution in 1776 to the end of Latin American independence movements in 1821, most of the American continents went from being mainly colonies to becoming new independent countries. And in Europe, the revolutionary spirit that had spread with Napoleon's troops sparked a series of popular revolts throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries that changed radically the face of politics and society in that continent. All right, so that's it for now. See you next time.